Hi, this is Kevin Gillan with Advanced Leather Solutions. I oftentimes get questions about the nature of leather, how it's processed, how the colors are attained, etc. And so what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes talking about the nature of leather from its point that it goes through the tanning process all the way through to the point where the colors are applied. Let me begin by first talking about the two main ways that leather is tanned. The tanning process actually preserves the skin. The tanning process then also provides the attributes of that particular piece of leather. The two main categories are vegetable tanning and chromium tanning. Vegetable tanned leather produces a tough, durable leather. Think about the sole of a shoe, or perhaps a belt or a saddle. Whereas chromium tanned leather produces soft, supple leather. Think about a leather jacket, a golf glove, or a piece of furniture. So, to show you some distinctive differences between these leathers, here's an example of a veg-tanned leather. So you can see that it has a significant degree of thickness associated with it. You can see the color associated with it. This is a leather that has been tanned only with no color applied. We call this a crust. Here then is the same type of leather that is also a crust, that is also a veg-tanned leather, but notice the differential in thickness. So what happens is the leather, after it comes off of the cow and after it has been tanned, the leather is split, or the word in the industry that uses skived. That means that the leather is separated from one side, the top side, to the bottom side. So it's cut laterally. Here's a picture of a hide. So if you take a look at a skin, you normally have about 55 to 75 square feet. Some cases smaller than that, depending upon the maturity of the cow. And as you can see the odd shape, really the yield that is offered from a hide is typically about 65 to 70%. So there's a fair degree of waste in the process. So after the leather's been tanned, it's been cut and split, and the edges have been taken away. Chromium tanned leather, before it actually goes through the coloring process, looks like this. So this also is a crust. There's been no color applied. It has simply been a leather that has been run through the tanning process, and as you can see, it's got a fair degree of softness or suppleness associated with it. One of the attributes of these types of leather is that they are very vulnerable in the sense that there's no protective coating on the leather whatsoever. So these leathers are both can have a degree of potential for staining. Now, watch this. I just moisten the tip of my finger and I put it on there, and you can clearly see the effect of a little bit of moisture. The same thing is true when I apply it to the chromium tanned leather. You can see how the leather's absorbed the moisture and discolored. Oftentimes, a drop of moisture is not going to negatively affect the leather, as it'll evaporate away. So then the next step in the process is the leather is then dyed. Now, the hides are either, it's dyed in one of two ways. The hides are either dipped into a vat of heated dye, where the dye permeates the cellular structure of the hide from front to back, or it's pulled through a roller system. So let me show you those two different examples. Here's a leather that has been dyed all the way through. So you can see the front and the back are essentially the same color, and if you look at a cross section, it's dyed all the way through. So we call that struck through. Whereas this leather, you can see, is sort of an Oreo cookie look, where we have the chromium tanned leather that you can still see in the internals, and the outside and inside are showing the dye, where the leather has been pulled through a roller system where the dye was compressed into the leather but not all the way through. So leather coming off a cow ranges in its thickness depending upon where on the hide it comes from. It can be actually pretty thick, somewhere in the 3/8 of an inch thickness, all the way down to, of course, fairly thin. That leather then goes through a process where it's split, and it's split laterally where we have a lower image and an upper image. The upper image is the epidermis. That's where the dominant component of the strength is. We call that leather a full grain leather. That is to say, it's a leather that has not been altered in any way. It's the epidermis of the skin, and it has the highest degree of durability. Another word that is used in the industry is top grain leather. They are essentially synonymous, but some people will argue that a full grain leather has more durability than a top grain, but they are essentially both the same thing. That is to say, they are the epidermis of the skin. So now the other portion of it, the portion of it that has been split laterally, the lower portion is called a split because it's been split away. That leather does not have the same level of durability because it's immature. Keep in mind that the skin itself, just like your skin, grows from the inside to the out, and it takes a while for that durability to actually set. So let me show you some examples of what I mean. This is a leather that is a split. This is a leather that doesn't have the same level of durability that you would expect from a normal leather. Watch. I can tear it. Now, a human being should not be able to tear leather. Look at also, as I tear it, look at the fibrous structure. You see those long leather fibers that are inside the skin itself, and see how they extend out. That's an indication that the leather has not established the level of maturity necessary for it to develop the durability that you would expect. So here is a leather that is actually considerably thinner, yet it is the epidermis. I cannot in any way physically tear this. A human being cannot tear well-tanned top grain leather. So where the leather is coming from on the cow, in terms of whether it be a split hide or a epidermis, the epidermis of the skin determines the degree of durability that skin is going to have. All of that is controlled also by the chemical processes that are used in the tanning of systems. Depending upon the sophistication of that tanning system determines the degree of durability that is imparted into the leather. Now, having said all of that, what happens then in the next step of the process for coloring leather? Well, there are two main classifications. There's finished and unfinished. Unfinished leather is leather that is strictly dyed, whereas finished leather is dyed first and then a topical pigmented coating is applied to the surface. I have before us here some examples of the dyeing process and the finishing process, and let's talk about that for just a second, and the attributes. This is an unfinished leather. You can tell it's an unfinished leather because it has a look to it of a certain degree of a modeling effect. It is also vulnerable to staining and very vulnerable to fading. So here's a piece of leather that was been in a client's home for approximately 8 or so years, exposed to sunlight. UV is the culprit in sunlight that actually causes the dye molecule to be destroyed by the UV wavelength. That is an example of an unfinished leather. Whereas this is an example of a finished leather where there's a pigmented coating sitting on the surface. Let's take a look. The leather was dyed this color, and then a pigmented coating was applied to the surface, rendering that color. Here's an example of a layered pigmented coating. So it's dyed this color, a base color is applied, and then certain levels of what we call a print or overlay color is applied over the top of that, the degree to which gradually darkens the leather. So these are two examples of how leather can be finished as either a leather that is strictly dyed or a leather that goes through a finishing process that has a pigmented coating on the surface. That pigmented coating then can be layered, which can create this modeling effect. So it's dyed this and then color coded with a modeling effect so that you have this color variation that makes it look more organic. Now, another class of leather is this class of leather. This is what's known as an oil tanned or pull-up leather. So this leather has been dyed by dipping hides into vats of heated dye that actually the dye molecules are carried in an oil. The oil then permeates the cellular structure front to back, and it creates a distressing look. Now, when I pull on this leather, you can see how I'm distorting the color. See that? So what I'm doing is I'm actually moving the color around inside the fiber structure of the leather. The color The dye molecule is not bound to the fibers. It's literally floating in there. This creates then a look that is a distressed leather. The second way distressed leathers can be created is called a waxed. So you can see the crinkle effect of a waxed leather by looking at how the leather creates this sort of the lines in it that look like cracking or distressing of the leather. Now watch what happens when I warm this leather up. You see how it darkens? Again, warming the leather up, darkens it. Now, what I'm actually doing is I am reactivating the wax coating that is sitting on the surface of the leather, and if I then take this leather and crinkle it all up, I reestablish that crinkling effect. So this is intended to show a distressed leather by using a waxed coating that's sitting on the surface. Now, all of these coloring systems are designed to produce a particular kind of an effect, and that effect is what's going to determine its durability in the home. If you have an unfinished leather, then you have a leather that's got a great deal of beauty associated with it because the dye molecule is showing clarity of the color that can't be beat. The problem with it is that it stains and fades. Whereas a finished leather has got a pigmented coating sitting on the surface. The pigmented coating is not nearly as vulnerable to UV, so it doesn't fade nearly as much. And because there's a protective coating sitting on the surfaces, there isn't the potential for staining. To learn more about these products and processes rather for how leather is created, I'm happy to discuss that with you. We also have a document that we're happy to share with you that will give you more information. So give me a call at 510-786-6059 or look for us on the web at advleather.com. Thanks.